Hello, and welcome to the Slate Political Gabfest. October 27th, 2022, the Are British Politics More or Less Crazy Than Ours edition. I am David Plotz of CityCast in Washington, D.C. I'm joined by Emily Bazelon of the New York Times Magazine and Yale University Law School from New Haven, Connecticut. Hello, Emily.
Hello.
And from Manhattan, John Dickerson of CBS Primetime with John Dickerson. Hello, John. How are you?
Hello, David. Hello, Emily.
This week on the Gabfest, the state of the race 2 weeks out. How do the midterms look? Then we will try to make sense of the chaos that has engulfed the UK and its politics recently. We'll talk to Bloomberg Opinion's Adrian Wooldridge. Then Justice Thomas protected Lindsey Graham from an election-related subpoena. We'll catch up on the various Trump election, Jan 6th legal machinations that are going on. Plus, of course, we'll have cocktail chatter. And a reminder, this is our last regular show before our live show in Atlanta. Wednesday, November 2nd at 7 p.m. We'll be at Georgia Tech's First Center for the Arts. Slate.com/Gabfest Live to get tickets. Please come join us. It's going to be a really great show. We've got a good guest in hand. We have big plans for it. And it's just an incredibly interesting time to be in Georgia to talk about politics. So you wouldn't want to miss that, would you? Slate.com/Gabfest Live. Join us on Wednesday, November 2nd. John, what is the state of the race now? What is happening with each side's closing argument, to use a favorite John Dickerson phrase? And do we have any strong indications about one party or the other thriving or struggling?
I think we have to, haul in the salt truck, and the way you always would, and the way I always have, which is
no idea what
here's
that
what it looks
means.
like.
I'm so excited.
Well, I mean,
what the
a grain of salt, right?
Oh, I thought he was salting the roads.
Yeah, well, salt the roads also, because the road to perdition is paved with bad predictions. So, all right, here's the deal. I think on the House side, it is pretty much as we talked about before. What's happening is you have, regular gravity of politics appears to be continuing to assert itself, which is that the party that controls the White House has a tough time. A party with a presidency under 50% is in bad shape. And the mitigating issues, which were abortion and candidate quality, seem to not be a sufficient shield against those historical trends. And also other things like the fact that, you have a Democratic Party that doesn't want to reward its party for what it has done, but everything the Democratic Party has done irritates Republicans and makes them turn out to stop the ruination of America by the further continuance of success by Democrats. So you have this awful condition for the Democrats. When they get things done, they don't get credit and they get pain. So in the House, that manifests itself in the fact that things like, the House district in deep blue areas like Rhode Island, you've got, which hasn't sent to a Republican to Congress in the House for 3 decades, there's a competitive race there, which means it's not just the districts that are close, but there are blue areas where Republicans are making inroads. Will they win there? We don't know. But the fact that Democrats are having to worry and scramble and spend time, resources, and energy there suggests where the state of the map will be. In the Senate, you have some races that are only alive because they're bad Republican candidates and strong Democratic ones. So it looks like the chance that Democrats will hold on to the Senate is still possible, but maybe not. I mean, we that's really too close to tell. And races like the Pennsylvania Senate race, where Fetterman seemed to be, pulling away from his party and its problems. Obviously, that's, because of the recent debate and other things, but it was trending already, getting closer. He's not able to pull away from the problems Democrats are having the way people thought he might. And that's true in Ohio and other places, too.
We're going to go deep on Pennsylvania with a special episode on Sunday, and a special bonus episode in your feed. But let's talk about the most compelling political event of the week, Emily, probably the debate between John Fetterman and Mehmet Oz in the Senate race. What did you make of that?
I think the substance of the debate was actually pretty telling that the candidates outlined their positions in a way that was clear, although I found the format crazy. It was moving so quickly. It was really as if people didn't have time to explain themselves. I was interested in, John, I wondered what you made of this, that Fetterman clearly said he would support Biden running again. He didn't try to distance himself from Biden. And Oz did the same thing with Trump. So in a sense, they were kind of being traditional party loyalists in that moment. I guess it would have been really weird if they had taken a different stance, but I noticed that.
I listened to a very interesting episode of New York Times' The Daily on Thursday morning about the New York governor's race and New York in general. And New York is what's it called? It's a synecdoche for the whole country. It's a metaphor for the whole country, which is that you had the election sort of apparently at the start being fought on abortion and some on the kind of trouble that the Trumpists are causing and how we don't want Trumpists in elected office. But now that fall is here, crime, education, particularly those two issues, have taken so much of the mental brain space of voters. And there's such a big concern for people that even a state that Biden won by 23 points, it's an open question whether this Democratic incumbent governor can hold her seat against a really MAGA, election denying congressman from Long Island. And it's just fascinating the way the conditions of the country, inflation, concerns about crime, concerns about chaos, concerns about education loss are just really coming back at Democrats right now in a way that makes me think it's going to be a much worse election day for them than anyone had predicted.
And what you've just said, I think, is another way of saying political gravity is reasserting itself, which is the thing that is most acute and the daily experience of voters as close to or while voting is going on will tend to influence an election. I mean, that all seems consistent with our understanding of politics right now, and a story of Democrats holding off a wave is a harder story to tell, just period, let alone given the evidence of the moment. And one thing that's really on my mind is a state like Nevada, where the Republicans may very well pick up a Senate seat. Republicans may flip every seat, Secretary of State, Senate, governor. So that puts that state in a very different place for 2024, not only in terms of local ground, political strength for the presidential race, but also in terms of verifying the vote.
I want to talk a little more about crime and the way it's playing out in this election. So I don't think we've had a time in the United States in these many decades in which crime was either rising or perceived as rising, because that's part of what's happening right now. And the country, or parts of the country, have succeeded in continuing to decarcerate. Right. So we had rising mass incarceration. Then it started to come down slowly, beginning in around 2009. And now we're having a backlash to some of those policies. And that is really playing out in New York, where the legislature passed bail reform. Bail reform is getting blamed, I think, largely unfairly for perceived increase in danger. And then you have the governor and Eric Adams, the mayor of New York City, trying to pull back and say, we are being responsible. We're not going to have the same level of bail reform. We're trying to ensure that, quote, dangerous people are now not out on the streets. And yet it doesn't really seem to be working. And I just have this deep fear that
as a political
no matter
argument,
what
you mean it doesn't not working as a political argument. Yeah.
Yes, exactly. I feel like it's not resonating with the electorate. And I wonder what could ever be done to make the majority of Americans think that locking more people up is not actually the answer for preventing crime, right? It just seems like if you are the party that is trying to say there are other solutions and they have to do with prevention and dealing with, the roots of why people commit crime, like poverty, having more social spending, that always seems to sort of miss in these moments where there's a lot of fear of crime. And that is just making me kind of crazy. At the same time, I'm tempted to blame what I think is sort of excessive rhetoric about defunding the police and these messages that seemed really out of touch. Hochul, however, the governor of New York, was never a defund advocate, has always distanced herself. That's been true about President Biden and most Democratic candidates, and yet it doesn't seem to matter. I don't really have a question here. I'm just more making a kind of exasperated observation about this dynamic.
Can I turn it into a question, which is,
Please.
Well, first of all, Republicans have always benefited from the crime issue for a long time. It touches on race. It excites their voters for a variety of different ways. It's one of those issues where even if you say something out loud that's not true, it's fine because you're happy to get tagged with saying something untrue that keeps the conversation on your turf. So it seems consistent with our history in that regard. But Emily, what I wonder about is everything you just said, connect that with what we used to talk about years ago on this show, which was the unique confluence of conservatives who wanted to reduce the prison population and who were behind prison reform during the and criminal justice reform during the Trump administration. That movement, which came from the right and had people like Grover Norquist behind it, met up with a movement from the left and created this crazy coalition, which was in fact successful, maybe not successful enough by some people's estimations, but was successful in getting legislation passed. What happened to that movement, which was an interest in the right for a smarter criminal justice system than the just lock them up response? So I guess that's the question to you.
I think it's a great question. I think basically those reform instincts on the right have gotten swamped by the weaponizing of crime that's possible for conservatives. And I've especially noticed figures on the right who were sort of erstwhile reformers. They talked about how the return on investment for increased prison populations and spending is terrible, which is completely true. And yet attacking George Soros, a figure who has funded some of the progressive prosecutor candidates, just seems to be way too tempting. And so you see them doing that and attacking district attorneys who have, dared to be in favor of any kind of reform. It just seems like there's too much political mileage to resist there.
This week's Slate Plus bonus segment, Emily is going to talk to incarcerated journalist John Lennon and the creator of Freedom Reads, Duane Betts, the wonderful Duane Betts, about their Prison Letters project. That's a project they launched to respond to letters they get from incarcerated people to try to get them more resources and amplify their voices. Duane is so great, and anytime he's on the Gabfest, it's a special occasion. So check out Slate Plus. You can become a Slate Plus member by going to slate.com/Gabfest Plus. Also, I mentioned this in the last segment. We didn't really go deep on Pennsylvania in that last segment because we are doing an entire bonus episode about it on Sunday. Just check your Gabfest feed on Sunday for a special extra episode about the enthralling and tense Senate and gubernatorial races in Emily's home state, in the Keystone State, in the Commonwealth, whatever you guys call it. This episode of the Gabfest is sponsored by Factor. Fall is here, new season, new routine. And if you are sick of the same old day after day, try Factor, because Factor has a ready-to-eat meal delivery service that makes it easy to switch things up. There are more than 30 meal choices each week. There are more than 36 weekly add-ons, and you can have an option to add protein to select vegan and veggie meals each week. Factor gives you fresh, never frozen meals, which make it easy to fuel up fast with meals delivered ready to heat and eat in just 2 minutes. And their rotating menu has tons of fall options every week. So you can have seasonal favorites like 3-bean vegan chili, which I had, which was really good. I had the 3-bean vegan chili the other day for lunch. It was really excellent. They also have an apple mustard pork chop. They have a Tuscan tomato chicken that you could add to your rotation to spice things up. And if you want to have more protein, you can add protein to some of the vegan and veggie meals to get an additional boost in every bite. They also have add-on options like smoothies and juices. And I have the smoothies in my fridge, often have a smoothie for breakfast, a Factor smoothie for breakfast, strawberry banana, tropical fruit, really tasty. So head to go.factor75.com/gabfest60 and use code gabfest60 to get 60% off your first box. That's code gabfest60 at go.factor75.com/gabfest60 to get 60% off your first box. This episode of the Gabfest is sponsored by Up First from NPR. You have definitely heard the term doom scrolling. You might even be doing it right now, whether it's Twitter or Facebook or some other site. It is so easy to get sucked in. You want to know what's going on in the world, but instead you just end up burnt out on bad news. If this sounds like your mornings, have a listen to the Up First podcast on NPR. Up First provides the 3 biggest news stories to start your day. It has digestible 15-minute episodes, so it has all the news you need. So you can get back to your life and feel informed, but you don't lose your mind in the process. You're not overloaded in the process. It's a concise description of the top news of the day. So you're just up to speed, but you're not overwhelmed. So stay informed every morning with Up First. Listen to Up First from NPR wherever you get your podcasts. We are joined from England by Adrian Wooldridge, the global business correspondent for Bloomberg Opinion. Adrian, at the current rate, how long until you are the Prime Minister of Great Britain?
Until I'm the Prime Minister, probably, I think, till eternity and until the apocalypse or something like that. But I think Rishi will be the Prime Minister for 2 years. I'd be surprised if he is unseated unless the Conservative Party has gone completely mad. Only sections of it, I think, have gone completely mad. But whether he survives after 2 years is much more problematic. I think the likelihood is that we will have a Labour government and Keir Starmer will be Prime Minister.
You've encoded a ton of information to that. So tell our extremely educated Gabfest audience, who is Rishi Sunak and how is it that the government has fallen and fallen again, and yet there is no election?
Well, under the British system, which is very different from your system, the governing party, the party with the most seats, chooses the Prime Minister. The Prime Minister is essentially just an instrument of the governing party. So they can change the Prime Minister whenever they feel like it, within these very complicated rules that they've set for themselves. So there doesn't have to be a general election because the Prime Minister is first amongst equals. He's just first amongst the MPs. He's not somebody who stands and is voted for on a slate as you would have in a presidential system. We've had a lot of Prime Ministers recently. Liz Truss was the most traumatic or problematic of them all. She lasted for as long as it takes a supermarket lettuce to go off, 40 odd days, and she's now been replaced by Rishi Sunak, who is interesting in many ways. Rishi Sunak is the first non-white Prime Minister that we've ever had. First, I think, minority Prime Minister we've ever had. He's also the first, non-Anglican Prime Minister we've ever had. He is a Hindu. He took his oath of office when he came in as an MP on the Bhagavad Gita. He celebrates Diwali, and it was quite interesting that he was actually selected by the MPs on the most important day of Diwali. So it was a sort of historic. It was a historic moment for what is a very old country. He is extremely competent. He's a technocrat. He's a person who runs things very well. He's a person who likes to manage things with aplomb. He's the very opposite of Liz Truss's predecessor, and very opposite sort of physically of Liz Truss's predecessor. I mean, Boris Johnson was sort of overweight, couldn't comb his hair, his trousers were always falling down, everything about him was disheveled and disorganized. I mean, and Rishi is the exact opposite of that. His suits are perfectly pressed, even his leisure clothes are perfectly pressed, his hair perfectly combed, he's very neat, very thin ties, always perfectly turned out. And, and he ran number 11 Downing Street, which was he was the Chancellor before he was Prime Minister with a short gap. He ran that like a very, very efficient machine. And Downing Street, number 10, where the Prime Minister lives, was certainly not a very efficient machine. And he's also a teetotaler. And if you remember, one of the many reasons why Boris Johnson fell from office was parties that were being held, rather raucous, wild parties being held in number 11. And Rishi is not a person who is given to parties.
So watching this from across the pond, I thought of the joke that it's only when things get terrible that you put a woman in charge, and then things get worse and you put a person of color in charge, right? That you have all this inflation, that people are terribly concerned about the cost of living, that, Brexit continues to unfold with some degree of non-resolution, right, in terms of Northern Ireland's status and how that is really working. I feel like Rishi Sunak's advantage is that Liz Truss was such a disaster, that he's going to come in and people are going to feel such relief that there's this person of great competence and organization, as you describe. And yet he's going to be confronting these underlying conditions, which are still a real problem for the country. And there's, I think, going to be a lot of suffering and people worrying about these pocketbook issues. And I wonder how you think about those challenges for his leadership.
Absolutely. He has got an enormous... Britain was facing a very difficult set of circumstances when Liz Truss came in. With inflation, one of the worst levels of inflation, a very, very divided society, one of the worst levels of inflation in the Western world, a very divided society, very low productivity growth, and a cost of living crisis driven partly by Putin, partly by deeper-rooted things. All of those things were huge. And a balanced book that the markets were being very generous to Britain. There were lots of weaknesses that the markets were forgiving in Britain. And what happened with Liz Truss is she turbocharged all of this. She's made all of these problems much bigger, and the markets are now skeptical about Britain in the way that they weren't before. So it's a very difficult set of problems, and he is going to have to be the austerity Prime Minister. We'll have very serious squeeze on living standards for a prolonged period of time, and squeeze on public spending for a prolonged period of time, at a time when the National Health Service is, really, really thinly stretched, and other public services are thinly stretched. So it's a very difficult set of circumstances, but he can sort of blame it on the sort of the kamikaze budget of Liz Truss, and he can get some sort of, kudos or credibility for righting the ship, which I think we are righting the ship a little bit. So that'll be more difficult.
Adrian, we were fortunately together this summer, and Liz Truss was not yet in office, and you had a persistent and consistent concern about what a prime ministership under Liz Truss would be, and you seem to have been exactly right. Why didn't other conservatives recognize that, A? And the reason I ask that is, what does that mean about the Conservative Party and its tolerance for Sunak? I mean, it seems to be a restive party without a clear path. And does he have to worry about that as he tries to do all these other complicated things he's got to do?
Yeah, he balancing forces in the Conservative Party is very difficult. And one of the things that he's done recently is to reappoint a woman called Suella Braverman, who was sacked as Home Secretary for using her private email when she shouldn't have done, and is very much on the right of the party. And he's upset a lot of people by reappointing her. And a lot of people are very confused as to why he's reappointed her when he had a perfect excuse not to reappoint her. And I think that shows how strong the grip of the nativist right, actually, is on the party. But the reason why, the interesting thing about Liz Truss, I think, is, and I was indeed very worried about her rise, but I think it does show that the right of the party is scraping the bottom of the barrel. That when it comes to talent, charisma, and indeed, as we saw, competence, she wasn't the sort of person you'd go for first. They've been through all the people that they thought they could go through. Theresa May, who they thought was one of theirs. And then even more than that, Boris Johnson. So they keep choosing these people, and they explode because the populist right is running out of talents, and the only ones left really who fulfill their ideological criteria are at least 1,000 years old. Like John Redwood and people. They're ancient. So it does show a problem with the right of the party on talent. Now, as I said, Rishi Sunak is on the right of the party. He's a conservative. He's a Thatcherite. I mean, he's a right-wing conservative Thatcherite. But he's also connected with the real world. He understands the difference between the real world and the fantasy world. And he's a technocrat. He's a right-wing technocrat. And Liz Truss was, well, let's do the Reagan thing. Let's cut taxes and let's increase spending and everything will be great. She was unconnected with the real world because Britain doesn't print the world's reserve currency. So we can't really do what Reagan did. And I actually, at one point, a few years ago, when Liz Truss was Chief Secretary of the Treasury, which is number 2 in the Treasury, she invited me to have lunch with her in the House of Commons. So I had this long lunch with her, and she was very generous with her time and made a lot of comments about policy which were directly contradicting the policy of the Chancellor of the Exchequer at the time, her boss. And I thought this lunch was very strange because she kept taking photographs of me and the food that I was eating. And the answers that I would give, I mean, the questions that I would ask, the answers that she gave bear no relationship to what I was saying. It was just weird. The whole thing was weird. So I thought, I was supposed to be writing a profile for her for the budget page of The Economist. And I listened to all of this, and I concluded after a while, no, I'm not going to write a profile because this person's going nowhere. This is just somebody who's flaming out. And she phoned me up a few weeks later and said, "Where's that profile you were working on?" And I said, "Well, I didn't do it." So I didn't do it. I just thought that this is obviously not somebody who's, she's reached the heights and is now going to collapse. I've still got the notes on this interview, but I did prove to be right. But she had to go through the job of Prime Minister before she finally flamed out.
Why was she taking pictures of you and your food?
She's obsessed with Instagram. She's absolutely obsessed with Instagram. So she took photographs of me, my food, and then of us two standing together next to the Thames. Everything she did, she would Instagram.
So that made it public. She made all that public.
Oh, absolutely. And she didn't ask me whether I was happy to be Instagrammed with her, which I thought it was all... but she's a very strange person. The whole thing was very odd, but I didn't think that the right of the Conservative Party would go for her, partly because she is so odd in her personal behaviour and so uncharismatic. But they went for her, as I say, scraping the bottom of the barrel. But there are two sort of strands in the right at the moment. One is the sort of populist strand, which was embodied by Boris Johnson, which is, the establishment is appalling. Wisdom lies in ordinary people, deliver Brexit, all of that. And then there's the libertarian strand, which is at the point of Brexit was to turn Britain into the, Singapore on Thames and to get rid of regulations which is the opposite of levelling up and Brexit. It's, let's have the fewest possible regulations and then let's not be concerned about inequality because it doesn't matter as long as we've got growth. So we've seen both of those strands on the right, the populist strand with Johnson and the libertarian strand with Truss exploding. So now we have, a conservative technocrat in charge.
Adrian, you are a student of you write about global politics and global business. And so it's from America, it's easy to laugh. There's so many jokes about, haha, Boris Johnson, haha, Liz Truss, haha, that lettuce. But is British politics more functional than American politics? At least they were able to expel these unpopular and unappealing leaders and maintain sort of the general the system has not failed. The system is working. That seems good.
Yes, I think Boris Johnsonism is very similar in lots of ways to Trumpism. And it has the same lack of discipline, the same demonization of the establishment, the same, just raw Jacksonian sort of energy. But it's not as deeply rooted as Trumpism, and it isn't quite as crazy as Trumpism, because Boris is playing at this sort of stuff, and Trump actually believes it. And that's an important distinction, I think. So there is a nasty side of British politics, and there's a nasty side of Johnsonism. And I think about 100 MPs failed to declare which side that they were on in the struggle for the nomination. And the reason they failed to declare which side they were on is that they were terrified of revenge from Johnson's people in the constituencies, that they thought that there'd be deselection or uncivil behaviour. So the Trumpists, the activists, the Johnsonians in the constituencies are there, and they're not, and they're angry, and they will push for their man in the way that the Trumpists push for their man. But it isn't quite as it hasn't gone. It hasn't gone as far as it has in the United States. It's a similar sort of thing. As I say, what's worse? If you're Trump, you believe what you're saying, and you're not very well educated, and you don't understand that being elected president doesn't make you dictator of the country. You just don't understand what the Constitution is. Johnson does understand all of these things. He is educated, and he doesn't believe most of it. He is playing at it. Does that make him a worse person or a better person than Trump? I'm not sure. But I would say with MPs, I think the Conservative Party in Parliament is going further in de-Johnsonifying itself than the Republicans are, that they've realised that Johnson is a bad man, in the sense that he's utterly selfish, only interested in himself, and will always betray them. So I think that he's lost the party more than Trump's lost the Republican Party.
Adrian Wooldridge, global business correspondent of Bloomberg Opinion. Adrian, thanks so much for coming on the Gabfest.
Thank you. Thank you.
Hello, Gabfest listeners. This is Amanda Ripley, host of Slate's How To podcast. We have something super exciting to share with you. You all know that this can be a difficult time of year for lots of reasons, and especially around Thanksgiving, it can be really hard to talk about politics with family members that you disagree with on fundamental, basic facts and worldviews. So, instead of giving you abstract, hypothetical advice, which you've probably heard before, we actually got the chance on How To sit down with a real-life family, and Monica Guzman, an author and Braver Angels expert, who helped all of us work on how to have better conversations, more interesting conversations, more meaningful connections, even when we disagree profoundly. And not only did they take the coaching, but this brother and sister went to their dad, asked him if they could have a different kind of conversation, and recorded it. Spoiler alert, we had some actual breakthroughs. You can find this episode by searching for How To from Slate, wherever you get your podcasts.
Hey, it's Lizzie O'Leary here, host of What Next TBD. Do you ever wish all your podcasts were ad-free? Well, Slate has a very sweet deal for you. For a limited time, you can get 6 months of Slate Plus for just $29. That's 50% off. With your membership, you get no ads on any of our podcasts, unlimited reading on the Slate site, and member-exclusive episodes and segments on shows like Slow Burn and Political Gabfest.
Why don't you guys like the monarchy? What's not to like about it? Constitutional monarchies are the most functional governments in the world.
Did you read about how Charles has just gotten incredibly wealthy off of this whole thing and just thought a little bit about how colonialist the entire tradition is? Like, are you just hand-waving at all of that?
Want to hear what your favorite hosts are really thinking? Slate Plus is the only way to access this content. Sign up now at slate.com/podcasts plus. Again, that's $29 for 6 months of your Slate Plus membership. This deal ends after October 28th, so sign up now at slate.com/podcasts plus.
Justice Thomas briefly has protected Senator Lindsey Graham of South Carolina, the Republican senator, from having to testify to a Georgia grand jury about the attempts to overturn the presidential election results in Georgia. Graham was enlisted, volunteered, was part of President Trump's rather sinister and troubling efforts to get Georgia to flip its results into Trump's favor. The Supreme Court will probably quickly hear Graham's arguments, which had been rejected. Graham's arguments that he shouldn't have to testify, which were largely rejected by an appeals court that had a Trump majority in the 11th Circuit. But for the moment, Graham doesn't have to go testify. What is this Georgia grand jury investigating, Emily, and why do they want to talk to Graham?
It's called a special purpose grand jury. It can sit for longer periods than a regular grand jury, and it has the power to subpoena whoever the targets of an investigation are so that they can provide testimony, but it doesn't itself issue indictments. So basically, it's there to aid the prosecutor to figure out whether there should be an indictment, but it's not a formal criminal grand jury in the usual order of things. To me, this seems like a distinction without a difference, but in an effort to throw up whatever legal chaff is possible in this investigation, some of the targets are not surprisingly making a big issue of it.
But can you go back? I mean, what are they investigating? It's the Fulton County District Attorney, Fani Willis, is investigating what? Why does this grand jury exist? What is its purpose?
The grand jury exists because Donald Trump, when he was president, made a famous phone call to Brad Raffensperger, to Brad Raffensperger, the Secretary of State in Georgia, saying, I just need 11,000 votes and change. Can you help me find those votes? Georgia has a statute that seems to directly address the issue of trying to interfere with the results of an election. And so the question is whether the district attorney of Fulton County is going to indict Trump or other figures involved in this effort to what appears to be pressure Raffensperger to go look for some presumably non-existent votes to throw the election to Trump.
And it not only includes Trump, but also his former chief of staff, Mark Meadows, who on Wednesday of this week was compelled to testify by a judge in that case as well.
Yeah, exactly. I mean, this is, in my view, one of the most serious, probably the most serious legal threat that Trump and Meadows and potentially Graham face, because this statute is such a close fit for the conduct here, and the call that Trump made to Raffensperger is on tape.
And Graham's defense is that when he was making the phone calls, he was acting in his position as chairman of the Senate Judiciary Committee, and that he was essentially on a fact-finding mission to investigate the possible voter fraud in Georgia, which shielded him for a while, but then didn't, and now may shield him. Although all Thomas did was put things on pause.
I kind of think Thomas is trolling here. What we really found out was that Thomas is not planning to recuse himself from these January 6th investigatory matters, even though his wife, Ginny Thomas, was involved in lobbying for, some of the election brouhaha leading up to January 6th. In any case, the Supreme Court is going to resolve this defense from Lindsey Graham. Graham is claiming that he doesn't have to testify because of the speech and debate clause in the Constitution. I was so flummoxed by that I had to go look it up. I thought that the speech and debate clause applied to members of Congress when they are speaking on the floor of Congress. Like, that's when you're doing your legislative work in the most clear way. But it has sometimes been interpreted more broadly to protect their, quote, legislative work outside of the context of actual floor debates. And that's the kind of, I would argue, thin reed that Graham is counting on here. We should say he did win a kind of partial victory before the district court judge, who said he has to testify on matters that obviously had nothing to do with a fact-finding mission for Congress, but not about things that might fall under that rubric. I don't know whether the Supreme Court's going to go for that or not.
There is this absurdity to this claim. I remember I have a friend, former colleague of ours who I won't name, who is basically a freelance writer, and he basically deducted every single thing he spent money on from his taxes, because he said it's all research. So like if he'd go out for a meal with you, he'd like deduct it because he'd like, that's research. Or if he went to a movie, that's research. So it was all tax deductible. And I feel that's the kind of claim that Lindsey Graham is making, is that anything I do is a legislative purpose. Like, it doesn't matter that there's no committee investigation that's been created. There's no bill that's under discussion. There's no official investigation. It's all like, I'm just gathering string for a future legislative act. And I do remember, I mean, there's hypocrisy is so easy to find and so hard to punish, and who cares anyway. But one of the claims that Republicans kept making about the attempts to get Trump's tax records, if you guys remember this, was that it was that it wasn't a legitimate legislative purpose, that this committee that wanted to see Trump's tax records had no legitimate legislative purpose, therefore shouldn't get to see Trump's tax records. And here you have Graham who's basically making the, trying to make the flip side claim, trying to say that everything I do is a legitimate legislative purpose. It's much more far-fetched than a committee that actually wanted it.
Yeah, his epistemological rigor is it was particularly flabby on these election claims. He also said excitable things about the mail carrier from Erie, Pennsylvania, who said that he saw postal, his supervisors tampering with mail-in ballots. And then which on its face sounded incredibly sketchy, but Graham rushed to that, again, in this same capacity as, the one true Sherlock Holmes on the case, when the more plausible reason is to lend credence to anything that would support Trump's lie about the election being stolen. And then, of course, the investigation into that Erie mail carrier was essentially what seemed true on its face at the time, which was he was just assuming some stuff might have happened that he heard from a guy might have happened. And so the Georgia case is part of a larger sort of role that he was playing in trying to keep the ball in the air for President Trump at that period.
I mean, Emily, my assumption is that a lot of these folks, Meadows, Graham, Trump himself, who was subpoenaed by the January 6th committee, they're just running out the clock. They're playing just to delay things, and the way the sloth of our court system and the fact that the House will almost certainly be a Republican House next year, and they'll disband that select committee in 14 seconds, means that Trump will never have to testify to that committee, and that Meadows and Graham may be able to just sort of extend this long enough that they don't actually have to face consequences.
You are for sure right about the subpoena from the Congressional Committee investigating January 6th and Trump, right? Because once the Republicans win the House, that subpoena would have to be reissued, and it never will be. In fact, Bart Gellman wrote an interesting piece for The Atlanta this week predicting that what that Republican House will do is start impeaching Joe Biden and maybe some other folks too. So absolutely, when it pertains to Congress, I mean, Fani Willis's investigation in Fulton County, Georgia, is different, right? That's a state investigation. So yes, I still think that Graham and Meadows are stalling, but Fani Willis is not going to be out of power in November.
One thing we should note about Graham, though, is that I think he's in a different category than Meadows, even though he was I think he's been told, and maybe, Emily, this is baloney, but he's been told he's just a fact witness. I mean, in other words, he's not a target or anything like that.
Yeah, that's true.
Let us go to cocktail chatter. When you are engaged in a long conversation with the president and having a back and forth, and you want to share something interesting with the president, Emily, what will you be sharing?
Ooh, now this is going to seem like I'm currying favor. I wanted to note that the Justice Department this week formally banned the use of subpoenas and court orders to seize the communications records, like notes and tapes of reporters, in order to try to get them to testify to uncover confidential sources when the government is investigating a leak. And this is the latest chapter in this long-running fight over, what happens if there's a leak in the federal government and the person accused of leaking talked to a reporter along the way. The Obama administration took some steps to try to get records from journalists, and the Trump administration did that as well. And now Attorney General Merrick Garland is saying that with very few exceptions, this is off limits. And it's a move toward, as Garland said, recognizing the crucial role that a free and independent press plays in our democracy. And it's always just really interesting whether reporters get treated with a kind of extra solicitude as opposed to anybody else who a source might be talking to. And this is a move toward sort of recognizing the free press as separate and having a bit of its own protections. I was teaching a class this week in which the guest said that part of what's at issue in situations like this is, the Constitution talks about protecting free speech and the free press. And usually we just mush those things together because there is no way to license reporters or kind of limit who calls themselves a journalist. But this is the kind of move that suggests that there is a separate protection for the free press. And it's obviously just a voluntary one that the Biden administration has adopted. A future president can change it. But I think it will be a source of relief for reporters who talk to sources in the federal government.
It will last until day 2 of the next Republican presidential administration. Day 6. John Dickerson, what is your chatter?
My chatter is about 2 organizations trying to shine light, keep us all paying attention to the various different challenges to our free and fair election system. One is States United Democracy Center, and the other is Third Way, which is the kind of center-left think tank, which has launched the Paul Revere Project. Both of them are clear. I've talked to them this week in preparing for election day and election week and election perhaps all the way into January to be able to be on my toes about where all the challenges exist in the various legislatures, at the precinct volunteer level, state legislatures, and how these ripples will go out from 22 into 24. Anyway, it's all, great material that they have on their websites. And both were also quite anxious to promote and say what is true, which is that while we are having these conversations, millions of Americans are voting safely, securely, and without issue, despite the intimidation that was taking place in Arizona with the guys with weapons near the drop boxes. But, that voting, even though we're expecting hard weather, voting is still safe and secure in the overwhelming, vast majority of the ways in which it's taking place and will take place. So that's an important thing to remember. And then their work is also important to check out if you're concerned about where there might be issues.
My chatter, 2 chatters, because I just saw something that delighted me so much. I'm going to add a second chatter. First is about a depressing story in Wired, hot on the trail of a mass school shooting hoaxer, which is a really disturbing story about how in towns across the U.S., but especially in Minnesota, there's been a spate of false mass school shooting reports. And so the emergency services, the cops will get a call that there's a school shooting in a local school, and the entire emergency first responders armature of that town and nearby towns will galvanize and gather. The school will go into lockdown. There will be panic and chaos and distress. And then it turns out it's a hoax. And there's a bunch of them, and these are made by Wired investigated and figured out. It was being made from calls overseas. They were spoofing American numbers, but it was through IP addresses out of Ethiopia. But the IP addresses, the person making the call could have been from anywhere. And hugely disruptive, basically anonymous, almost impossible to stop. And I actually am kind of wondering, man, if I were a Russian troll and I want to screw with Americans, I would do this in every school. I would do this in 10 school districts a day just for kicks, because it's incredibly disruptive and it causes panic. It is an act of terror. It causes terror and fear and increases the chances of accidents from these emergency vehicles rushing. People's own fear response. That maybe someone will get accidentally shot. Who knows what can happen? And it's just a really disturbing story about something that's been happening at a small scale that could happen to big scale. So that was depressing. On the delight end, so the fact that Elon Musk is about to take over Twitter has prompted sort of apocalyptic thinking from some people on Twitter who are all like, oh, this is the last day of this website, et cetera, et cetera. And there was an amazing tweet thread from Ben Collins at @1__Mark. And he just invited people to submit their favorite tweets of all time. And it's this collection of amazing, funny tweets. It goes on and on. And I was starting to read this morning as I was having my coffee, and I had to actually stop. I only got like 10 tweets in because I was snorting up my coffee as I was drinking it. There's so many great tweets. I know Twitter is a problematic website, problematic platform, but man, the stuff that's funny on Twitter is so funny. So check it out. And of course, listeners, you have also sent us chatter. You've tweeted them to us at @SlateGabfest. And you email them to us at gabfest@slate.com. And this week's listener chatter comes from Brian DeGeer.
Hi, Gabfest. This is Brian from Irvine, California. And my chatter is about this really great video series from Fiona Apple on her experience as a court watcher in St. George's County, Maryland. Apparently, Fiona started court watching during the pandemic by attending proceedings over Zoom. In this 8-part video series, she talks about injustices ranging from seemingly small indignities to what feel like true systemic conspiracies against folks that are just trying to navigate the justice system. At a time when we've heard so much about celebrities using their platforms for bad, it's really refreshing to hear about a celebrity using their platform for real, undeniable good.
That is our show for today. The Gabfest is produced by Shana Roth. Our researcher is Bridget Dunlap. Our theme music is by They Might Be Giants. Ben Richmond, Senior Director for Podcast Ops. Alicia Montgomery, VP of Audio for Slate. Follow us on Twitter at @SlateGabfest. Tweet chatter to us there. And please come to our live show on Wednesday. We'll be in Atlanta. Love to see you there. Slate.com/Gabfest Live to get tickets. Wednesday at 7 p.m. For Emily Bazelon and John Dickerson, I'm David Plotz. We'll see some of you on Wednesday in Atlanta, and we'll talk to all of you again on Thursday.
Hello, Slate Plus. I know usually it is David who welcomes you to Slate Plus, but I have taken over Slate Plus today because I want to talk about this project that I am part of launching that I'm super excited about. And I have two of my favorite people in the world to discuss this with. One is John Lennon, who is a journalist. He writes from the place where he's incarcerated and is a frequent contributor to the New York Times and to Esquire and has a new excellent piece out in the New York Review of Books. Hi, John.
Hey, Emily. Thanks for having me.
So glad you're here. And the second guest today is Dwayne Betts, who Gabfest listeners know and love already. He is a poet and a lawyer and the creator of Freedom Reads, an amazing project to bring libraries into prison. Hi, Dwayne.
Hey, how's it going?
We are here to talk about the Prison Letters Project, which is a project that we launched to respond to letters that we get from incarcerated people to try to amplify their voices and, if possible, bring more resources to bear on all of the issues they face. John, could you talk a little bit about why you have come on board to this project, to my great delight, which was, of course, Dwayne's idea, and what you're hoping to accomplish?
Yeah, so when Dwayne brought it to my attention, he was just talking about how it stemmed from the magazine piece that I had read that you wrote about Utica O'Reilly, and I was like, wow, I really dig that piece because you're sort of like confronting. It's kind of like a first-person style piece, and you're really like confronting like what is it that is like sort of our duty or that we can do as journalists, and how much is this like? I mean, I just love that you were sort of confronting that, and I totally remembered it when he brought it up, and so when he sort of explained that, she was trying to just make a newsletter out of it, and he brought it to you that I may be interested, and then you sort of suggested, let's just do it together. I just thought I was just obviously honored, but then it's also, I was just telling Dwayne, and he was like, how is it that when guys hear about that, how do you sort of handle that? So it's like, there's so many people that are in need, like Utica is in need, and then it's like, it's tough to sort of like tell folks about it, to be excited about it. And then it's like, also, it's just like, well, maybe I should write a letter to Emily too. How are you guys going to sort of highlight mine? Or like, it's always that kind of thing. So while it's exciting, it's also an opportunity. it's also a balancing act too, and I think we can get into that a bit.
Yeah, so just to clarify, we're taking these letters in, writing back to folks, asking them if we have their permission to publish aspects of their stories with their initials as opposed to their full names on a public database that Freedom Reads is hosting. And then you're leading an effort to also write a kind of periodic newsletter for the New York Times Magazine that will highlight some of these stories. So, Dwayne, you and I have been talking about this for a long time, and you've been super encouraging and also, I think, appropriately cautious or skeptical about various aspects of this. And I just wonder how you're feeling about it at this point.
I'm of two minds, to be perfectly honest. I recognize that the great power in this is that all of a sudden people inside can feel like they're
That was just a snippet from our Slate Plus conversation. If you want to hear the whole conversation, go to slate.com/Gabfest Plus to become a member today.